Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. In this video, I'm going to be talking about one of the most interesting historical figures I've ever read about, and one whom I've spent several years reading and writing about on my blog, and that is Thomas Edward Lawrence, more famously known as Lawrence of Arabia. What I'm going to be doing in this book is really focusing on the books that played a big part in his life, because he was a very bookish person, very literary, and we're going to be going over his life, why he's famous, kind of talking about why his life is relevant to us today, because I find him to be not only an inspirational figure, but he has a lot of insight for those of us living in the early 20th, or early 21st century, I should say. So that's what we're going to be doing, and I hope this is somewhat interesting, but by the end of it, I hope that you are as convinced as I am that he is an interesting person and worth reading about. So how did I get into all this to begin with? My brother recommended the movie Lawrence of Arabia, which stars Peter O'Toole. This is an old movie from the 60s, and I thought it was going to be super boring, but it's actually a really good historical drama. It's super long, but it covers all of the highlights of his career and what he did in the First World War. And it kind of got me started on this path of reading about him, because actually the real life character is even more interesting than the movie character, as you can imagine. And I was just curious, what kind of person decides to insert themselves into another culture and sacrifice so much for another group of people? Is it genuine? Was it fake? What was he hoping to get out of it? So that was kind of my motivation for starting to read more about him. Before I really get into the books, I just wanted to talk about a few things that tie all of this together to the present day, and I'm calling them the 3 I's. So I'm going to show something on the screen here about it. But first one I would say is identity. So a few of us have been talking about identity lately, for some friends and family. And I just feel like, I think we all sense that there's kind of a general sense of identity crisis going on in the world right now. And you see that in a number of ways. You see it in various subcultures that pop up. You see it in identity politics, which are quite powerful now. And there's a sense that people don't have a solid identity, so they go looking for one. You'll see that a lot in Lawrence's life, and the way he dealt with it, I think, can give us some insights on how we can handle identity crisis. The next I is institutions. So again, with the identity, there's this sense of loss of institutions, and that was very much the case 100 years ago, just as it is today. The way I would see it is, World War I would say institutions were imploding on themselves. They had grown so large, so in some cases corrupt, that they just started to crumble for various reasons. And then later on, post 60s, you see institutions being actively destroyed. So these are all things that, are kind of circling back in the 21st century, and were very core to the things that Lawrence experienced and observed in his life. The third I want to talk about is imperialism. So when you think about imperialism today, think about it more in the terms of globalism, and what are the entities that are really influencing different economies and driving political events. You're going to see a lot of that in Lawrence's career, as he was part of the British Empire. Fourth I, on a slightly more positive note, is imagination. So again, what do we see today? We see a lot of creative types making changes in the world, and Lawrence was one of those creative types 100 years ago who did the same thing. So the last I is infidelity, and that's infidelity between people and infidelity between nations and groups of people. And that really segues into the early part of T.E. Lawrence's life. He was born in the late 1800s, and he had a pretty normal childhood on the outside. He had a bunch of brothers and a very loving father and a strict but also loving mother. And everything seemed fine, but at some point he learned that his parents were not married, that his father had left a previous family and run away with the daughter's governess, who was Lawrence's mother. And it was extremely ironic because his mother was extremely religious. So for him to find all of this out, and it's not really clear when he found it out, but at some point in his childhood he found out, as you can imagine, it had a pretty negative impact on him. I would say, there's a lot of scholars that would say it certainly had lasting effects throughout the rest of his life and career. So that's kind of the background of Lawrence and his family. As I said, he was a very bookish person, and this started as a child. One of the things he did, or one of the books he wrote, I should say, early on, is one called Crusader Castles. This was actually written when he was at college. And what he did was, well, first of all, he had quite an obsession with the Crusades and with medieval architecture. So he went around in England and France, and I believe even, I'm trying to remember if he went to the Middle East at this point. I don't believe he went that far, but anyway, he went and looked at all of these different castles in various countries, and he photographed them. He wrote about their architecture. He even sketched out the plans for the castles, and basically he was trying to draw some correlations between Middle Eastern architecture and the Crusades back in Europe. So here's a picture of Lawrence and his brothers. That's him there, and his older brother, and I think these brothers are younger. Anyway, this was a very interesting book. One of the things that's really cool about this book is that he came back later and he actually annotated his own college paper and critiqued it and made funny jokes and stuff. So I personally thought this was very entertaining if you're a fan of Lawrence. And it shows you his thought process and his very scientific method of really trying to go about it in a very logical way, and yet sometimes he does sort of add a literary touch in his writing. He was actually trying to write an opposing paper to a very renowned scholar at the time, so he already had some lofty aspirations at this age. But it's really a fun book, very human. At the end of the book, there's a bunch of letters to his mother that he wrote. She saved them, and they were kind of added on to this book just for context. And again, he was very much interested in the Crusades even at this young age, and that definitely played a part in him wanting to go to the Middle East. So after college, I can't remember if it was after or during, he ended up becoming an archaeologist. As an archaeologist, he really had a great time. He was sort of an apprentice to this older gentleman who was kind of like just everyone's favorite professor kind of a guy, and just really had a great time there. And this was shortly before the war broke out. So when the war broke out, he was kind of already there. And what happened was, I believe he joined the intelligence agency there in Arabia, and just by being at the right place at the right time, and because of his knowledge and his familiarity with the languages, he kind of got into this great position for being sort of an advisor, even though he was still a very young man in his early 20s. And that's kind of how he started on this journey to become the leader of the Arab Revolt, or I should say the Western leader of the Arab Revolt. There were Middle Eastern partners, obviously. I'll just read the back of this here. This is 7 Pillars of Wisdom. This is his memoir about his time in Arabia. This is what the movie is based on. It's kind of a cool cover, by the way. There's actually 7 hills of sand on the front. But yeah, let me read the back here. So first of all, a blurb by Winston Churchill. Everybody should have a blurb by him on their book. He says, "It ranks with the greatest books ever written in the English language. As a narrative of adventure, it is unsurpassable." So that's pretty high praise from Churchill. It says, 7 Pillars of Wisdom is an unusual and rich work. It encompasses an account of the Arab Revolt against the Turks during the First World War, alongside Middle Eastern history, politics, adventure, and drama. So just a little context for those not familiar with the Middle Eastern theater. The Turks were, of course, the allies of the Germans, and you could say that there was sort of this kind of parallel desire in the Middle East to make sure the Turks did not expand outside the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And so it is also a memoir of the soldier known as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence is a fascinating, controversial figure, and his talent as a vivid and imaginative writer shines through on every page of his masterpiece. 7 Pillars of Wisdom provides a unique portrait of this extraordinary man and an insight into the birth of the Arab nation. A couple of things really stood out to me in this book. One was the way he became a leader was, again, being in the right place at the right time, but also just being extremely knowledgeable. I mean, he had a little bit of arrogance, so that kind of turned people off. But in the end, just through his knowledge and his intuition, he was able to assert himself as someone that people looked to for advice and for eventually guidance on this whole campaign. And that was, there were two things kind of going on here. So the bigger picture was the British and the French were trying to prevent the Turks from expanding. And again, it was part of World War I, so there were a lot of nuances there, but that's kind of the gist of it. And of course, at the same time, France and England were kind of competing for authority here in the Middle East. And then you've got this third component of the Arab tribes kind of coming together to support the British, but also, some of them. So one of the things this book does show you is that there was a lot of tribalism, and not all of them were actually interested in forming an independent Arab nation. But the one guy, Faisal, he ended up kind of becoming the figurehead anyway of that effort, and he worked closely with Lawrence to try to unify Arabia. But yeah, what makes this book so good is that it's got all of the drama of the movie, but it's a lot more detailed, and there's just some really heart-wrenching stuff in here too. For example, they kind of show the torture scene in the movie, but really he was actually sexually assaulted by the Turks, and he talks about that later on. It just left a terrible effect upon him ever after, I would say, according to the biographies I've read. So just things like that. And this isn't even the completely uncensored version, but it does talk about that. So I think this is a great memoir of a soldier of World War I, but it's also great from a personal perspective of an individual living at this kind of time, where he's caught between these different loyalties to the people of Arabia, loyalties to the British government, his own people, and him trying to figure out who he is, because he doesn't feel like he ever fits in anywhere, neither with the British nor with the Arabs. And again, going back to his childhood discovery of his illegitimacy, these kind of things, I think, were really prompting him to search for an identity, but I don't think he really found one, at least not in this book. The next book I want to talk about is it's more of an anthology. It's called Minorities, and it's a collection of poems that he put together during and after the war. And you can kind of think of this as his playlist. There's poems here that are contemporary, so, from World War I. There's some that are really old, and some that would have been probably 50 years old at the time. So quite a variety of poems. This even has some of the facsimiles of his copies of the poems. I thought this was kind of an interesting book. There's a lot of variety in here. Some of the poems are very angry and bitter and tragic. Others are more peaceful and beautiful. It really does seem like somebody's playlist as they go through a difficult time. Very interesting book, probably not for everybody, but if you're kind of reading about Lawrence, it gives you another layer into his personality and the things that he was reading at the time. So after World War I ended, the European powers were very much trying to divide up the Middle East, and there wasn't really a huge interest in letting some of those countries rule themselves. And at first, Lawrence participated in some of those discussions, trying to make sure that the Arabs got the independence that he had promised them, but things didn't work out as well as he had hoped, and he became very disenchanted with politics and with everything that he had done actually in the war. So it was very bittersweet, to say the least. And what he tried to do after the war was basically recover from all he'd been through. He ended up joining the Royal Air Force under a pseudonym. And all he wanted at that point was to be a very humble soldier. He didn't want to be famous anymore. So a couple of things he did at the time was he did some translation work because he was still interested in literature and poetry. He actually translated the Odyssey. So this was the version that I read. It's actually a prose translation, and I think it's a good translation from what I can tell. But one thing that was kind of interesting is if you read the translator's note, so his thoughts after he had translated it, you can definitely see that his experiences and perhaps just his age had kind of changed his view of these heroic stories. So, again, in his youth, he was very much into the heroism, the chivalry. The Death of Arthur was one of his favorite books, which he carried with him everywhere. But by this time, he was rather disenchanted with some of that stuff. And for example, he talks very disparagingly about the Odyssey and the characters. So you can see that he had changed a great deal and become more realistic, I guess. Certainly less idealistic. You can see he signed it T.E. Shaw. That was his pseudonym. Shaw, by the way, I don't believe it's a coincidence. He was great friends with George Bernard Shaw and Shaw's wife as well. George Bernard Shaw, the author of Pygmalion, the play that inspired My Fair Lady. And they were, great friends with him when he really didn't have many friends. So kind of a fun literary crossover there. Let me think. So there were a couple of other books towards the end of his life I don't have hard copies of. But the first one was The Forest Giant by a French author, and that author is now obscure, but Lawrence translated this work into English, and it was kind of a philosophical book about redwood trees. Kind of a weird book, but interesting in its own way. Sort of a good snapshot of the kind of literature that was coming out at the time. very, again, philosophical. The other book was called The Mint, and it's a memoir of his time as a Royal Air Forceman, and it's a very gritty story. It's not sugar-coated at all. It's watching some of these British dramas, you might think that, I don't know, that people were very genteel back then, but actually they were, normal people, quite coarse and vulgar at times. And he writes about all of that just as it was. And it's actually a very, very interesting memoir. And one of the things that's really particularly tragic about it is he talks about his rides on his motorcycle. And for those of you who've seen the movie or read about him, you'll know that that was how he died, in a motorcycle accident. He was swerving to avoid some children on the road, and that's how he died. So yeah, it's a bittersweet book, but quite interesting. And he talks too about how he had finally found a sense of peace as an anonymous, or essentially anonymous, soldier. And it's kind of sad. It's kind of tragic. I mean, coming back as a hero, you would think he would have been able to retire and just live happily ever after on his fame and the money he had made and so forth. But really, I would say he was traumatized, but by his experiences and by the damage he did, or that he thought he did, as this kind of folk hero, without having been able to meet all of the promises that he had made on behalf of the British government, due to politics and just his own ultimate powerlessness, you might say. So interesting that he did sort of find peace in the end, but just trying to get away from that previous identity as much as possible. So wrapping it up here, I want to talk real quick about biographies, if you're interested in reading a biography about him. Probably the most famous one at this point is called Hero, The Life and Legend of Lawrence of Arabia by Michael Korda. This was a very dense tome. It talks about everything you'd want to know and everything you didn't want to know, and it gives a lot of historical context. Again, probably ad nauseum, but I'm glad I read it. It's just I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. The next one I read was really good. It's called A Prince of Our Disorder by John E. Mack. This book, so John E. Mack was a psychologist, I believe, or a psychiatrist. I think he was a psychologist, an actual doctor. He wrote about Lawrence from that perspective, but it's a very, very respectful, very well researched, just a great biography. And he really approaches the human side in a very interesting way without getting too speculative, and again, always being respectful. So would recommend that one for sure. The third one that is kind of more of a picture book is called Lawrence of Arabia, The Life, the Legend by Malcolm Brown. I didn't really love the content of this one, but it has great pictures and, some pictures that you will definitely not find in other books. So I think it's a great kind of coffee table style book, worth checking out if you want more of just sort of like the basics with some pictures. The next biography that I'm kind of reading right now, or at least I started it, The Boy in the Mask, The Hidden World of Lawrence of Arabia. I did start this one. It's not as readable as Mack's book yet because it really focuses on his family. And there's supposed to be some new information here. I just haven't got to that part yet. But kind of interesting, especially if you're particularly curious about his father and all of that. So yeah, this is supposed to be really good. I just haven't got that far in it yet. And then the other one that I'm going to be reading, which I haven't started yet, is this one I mentioned, To Begin the World Over Again, which I talked about in a previous video. So I believe this one's also kind of a good short biography, at least according to reviews. I will actually link to my Goodreads shelf in the description because I have a bunch of other books that I'm planning to read that are either about him or somehow related to him. He was, again, like I said, really bookish. I'll show you guys a picture of his house. It actually has like books all the way around his bedroom with just a big bed in the middle. I think everybody wants a house like that, right? So that's all I have for this video. Let me know if you have any questions or ideas for other videos. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.